English translation. 643rd Contact Wednesday, the 3rd of February 2016, 10:04 hours.
Ah, you're waiting. Bernadette just asked me in the kitchen if you had been here before. But be welcome and greetings, Ptah, dear friend.
Greetings also to you, Edward, my friend. I heard about Bernadette in the kitchen, so I waited until you came to the workroom. It's unfortunate that your computer didn't store all the stuff we worked into the new Figu forum, but I was in a hurry because I still had some important work to do, so we'll have to do it again today. So if it's all right with you, I want us to do the job again right now.
Of course, because it's fine with me too when the matter is settled, so that Bernadette can tackle and process the whole thing in the afternoon. So I mobilize the computer so we can get started. But one more question. The article I wanted to write for the new Figu forum. I finished it after Florina got it and was supposed to beam it through to you.
That's what she did too, so I read it and found it good to include it in the new Figu forum.
All my available articles, etc., as well as the population list, and some others are pre-corrected. And various newspaper articles that we have received from Akim, I have prepared according to your wish, so that you can read at your discretion what you want to insert in the first edition.
Thank you, because that makes everything easier. But let us begin now.
Good, the computer is also ready.
We are done with that, and we can turn to other things.
Some questions I would have if there was nothing of importance we need to discuss?
First your questions, then we can turn to other things.
It is also fine by me. Yesterday I heard in the news that the USA wants to station larger troops in Eastern Europe against possible aggressive attacks by Russia, which I regard as complete idiocy and aggression by the USA. As a rule, it was always the Western states that attacked Russia, because the Russians always held back and avoided wars with the West.
Russia has not been a threatening country against the West since time immemorial. And so even today this state and its president, Vladimir Putin, do not have any aggressive plans against Europe or the USA. Putin is not anxious to start a war against anyone. But he is absolutely willing to engage in warlike defensive actions in the event of an attack. Russia has always been prepared to settle all disputes exclusively by political means. Russia has always been and continues to be an open-minded country, committed to the consolidation of cooperation and partnership with all, at least for those who have been willing to do so and continue to be so today. Even today, Russia has no aggressive plans and cannot have any. Consequently, this state, above all, Vladimir Putin, is not interested in threatening the West. Neither Europe nor the USA, and consequently Russia does not threaten anyone, but strives to resolve all disputes exclusively by political means. Russia and Putin respect international law and protect the interests of other countries. Russia is not aggressive, and if the opposite is claimed by the USA, it is just as much a malicious slander as if the same lying assertion is made by the EU dictatorship. Such lies and slander could not even be regarded as a bad joke, but only as a malicious and treacherous slander. And if the annexation of the Crimea is considered as a whole, then the military support for the separatists in Ukraine by Russia, as well as the operations in Afghanistan, Georgia, and Transnistria, must be regarded as operations of a special kind, because the population groups and authorities concerned have requested Russian aid, which is vehemently denied and concealed in the West in order to discriminate against Russia, which has unfortunately succeeded so far and will probably continue to do so. Of course, in Russia, too, as in many other countries, much is very questionable in domestic politics, but also in foreign politics, as the deployment of the Air Force in Syria proves, but that has nothing to do with aggression, but with false friendship and false desire for protection on the part of the dictator Bashar al-Assad, a criminal of the people with regard to his regime, which is exploiting Russia as a result of false friendship and dependence. And what is going on with regard to the fact that the USA wants to build more military units on the eastern borders of Europe? because aggression is supposedly to be expected from Russia does not correspond to the truth of the real reason. The fact is that on the one hand, the USA is afraid of Russia as a result of the U.S. incitement to war against Russia, in fear that it might wake up from its passive attitude and strike back militarily. On the other hand, another reason can be found in the USA's world domination addiction, namely because it is deceitfully and misleadingly leading an intrigue which is supposed to result in a peaceful annexation of the European Union dictatorship. And if this succeeds, then the USA will be able to settle down throughout Europe, whereby the sometimes very hostile US-American legislation will certainly be enforced throughout. It must also be said that the USA is the world's largest aggressor, as is the world's largest terrorist organization, responsible for the most diverse crimes against earthly humanity throughout the world. Whereas not even the 12 most brutal terrorist organizations such as Al-Qaeda, the Islamist State, the Mafia, Boko Haram, etc., can be named in the same way. Also, the USA with its aggression and terror around the world is worse than the 10 most brutal and largest criminal organizations, which use the term gang to describe violence. Power and organized crime, as well as capital crimes such as murder, drug trafficking, prostitution, human abduction, slavery, blackmail, and human trafficking, etc. Most gangs were founded in Central and North America to defend ethnic interests with murder and manslaughter, etc., and to commit capital crimes and criminal acts. In the meantime, their influence has greatly increased worldwide, and with it their brutality and unscrupulousness with which they tyrannize the world. The 10 most brutal, dangerous, and murderous criminal organizations of this kind are to be recorded as Mafia, which is spread worldwide. Then the Mexican Mafia, the Hells Angels in the USA, the Bloods organization criminally active in the USA, and the Chinese Triad Mafia. Then the racist U.S.-American Aryan Brotherhood, as well as the Black Guerrilla family in the USA, the U.S.-American Crips organization, the Mara Salvatrucha and the Mara Salvatrucha respectively. As criminal as these criminal organizations are, as criminal and contemptuous of human rights are the USA's actions with regard to its domestic and foreign policies, because it is only a matter of satisfying its own desires for power at home, as well as in relation to the whole world. And that countless corpses are being walked over without thought or conscience. As you once said, that is part of the agenda for the USA. By and large, the USA is psychopathically inclined towards the majority of rulers and about half of the population, from very small to very strong. Consequently, one can speak of a psychopathic state in which the righteous people, who are against the criminal domestic and foreign machinations of the USA, as well as against the death penalty and the criminal machinations of the U.S. Secret Services and against the U.S. mercenary system, are not listened to and given no chance to change anything in the country for the better. The psychopathic state is only interested in being able to exercise its rule and power in its own country and in the whole world. And consequently, all human and international rights are maliciously disregarded by the USA, especially by the majority of the Republicans, who are particularly inhuman and unscrupulous. A fact that also applies to the majority of the power-obsessed of the EU dictatorship, who do everything evil and wrong beyond the will of the EU peoples. This dictatorship is already partly a trabant of the USA. But the dictatorship elements leading to power in Brussels, and especially in Germany, are too naive to recognize this, as they also do not perceive what the German Chancellor really strives for. And since there are also many psychopathic forces in the EU dictatorship, they are drawing level with the USA and are increasingly letting their criminal machinations flow into the EU dictatorship as well. Psychopaths and psychopaths love each other and teach each other their evil and wrong actions, machinations, and deeds. And with regard to psychopathy in the USA, as well as in the EU dictatorship, I like this term you created very much, because it says what actually exists in the EU and in other earthly states. This is also proven by all the facts as they are mentioned in the number 32 issue of FIGU, Zeitzeichen, under the title Global Pathocracy, which I would like to have attached to my statements here.
Global Pathocracy, the 17th of January, 2016, the Troll of Germany.
One wonders why the Western elites are driven by such hatred against Russia and its head of state, Vladimir Putin. What are the deeper causes beyond the platitudinous accusations? Putin, the dictator. Putin, the threat to world peace. Putin, the megalomaniac and the propaganda of the new Cold War, beyond geopolitical goals, the US, which sees Russia as a threat to its global hegemony. In the end, it is two views of the world that collide, the normal man's and the psychopath's. Whether it is about personal relationships or international events, the scheme is the same. Those who are not completely absorbed by Western propaganda, as it is transported in the elite media, will clearly see which countries today have a psychopathic ideology, and which countries have a humane, normal view, to pick up Dr. Lobachevsky's expressions from his fundamental work, Political Ponerology. The United States/West embody the predator within the human species. Russia, the normal human being, that is to say, the human being with conscience. Dag Hammarskjöld, former UN Secretary General, put it this way in 1958. The conflict in which different concepts of freedom and the human spirit or human dignity and the right of the individual confront each other continues. It divides our fellow citizens as well as the peoples of other countries. It does not coincide with political or geographical borders. Ultimately, it is a matter of the struggle between man and non-man. It would be dangerous to believe that an individual, a nation, or an ideology alone can embody the truth, the sole claim to legitimacy, freedom, and human dignity. And that's why he had to die. The non-human psychopath regularly accuses others of what he blames himself for. He projects his own abnormal behavior onto others. See also the psychopath's trick, making us believe that evil comes from elsewhere. For example, the psychopathic West accuses Putin of aggression and imperialism. But the facts clearly speak for themselves. Since 1979, the USA has attacked, bombed and/or ravaged their governments. Salvador, 1980. Libya, 1981. Sinai, 1982. Lebanon, 1982. 1983. Egypt, 1983. Grenada, 1983. Honduras, 1983. Chad, 1983. Persian Gulf, 1984. Libya, 1986. Bolivia, 1986. Iran, 1987. Persian Gulf, 1987. Kuwait, 1987. Iran, 1988. Honduras, 1988. Panama, 1988. Libya, 1989. Panama, 1989. Colombia, Bolivia, and Peru, 1989. Philippines, 1989. Panama, 1989. 1990. Liberia, 1990. Saudi Arabia, 1990. Iraq, 1991. Zaire, 1991. Sierra Leone, 1992. Somalia, 1992. Bosnia-Herzegovina, 1993 to present. Macedonia, 1993. Haiti, 1994. Macedonia, 1994. Bosnia, 1995. Liberia, 1996. Central African Republic, 1996. Albania, 1997. Congo, Gabon, 1997. Sierra Leone, 1997. Cambodia, 1997. Iraq, 1998. Guinea-Bissau, 1998. Kenya, Tanzania, 1998 to 1999. Afghanistan, Sudan, 1998. Liberia, 1998. East Timor 1999, Serbia 1999, Sierra Leone 2000, Yemen 2000, East Timor 2000, Afghanistan 2001 to today, Yemen 2002, Philippines 2002, Ivory Coast 2002, Iraq 2003 to present, Liberia 2003, Georgia, Djibouti 2003, Haiti 2004, War on Terror in Georgia, Sasht, Djibouti, Kenya, Ethiopia, Yemen, Eritrea 2004, drone strikes on Pakistan 2004 to today, Somalia 2007, South Ossetia, Georgia 2008, Syria 2008, Yemen 2009 and 2015, Haiti 2010, Libya 2011, Syria 2011, Ukraine 2014, Iraq 2015, Libya 2015, Yemen 2015, etc., and they are trying to make us believe that Russia is the aggressor. The US has killed millions of innocent people. Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen, Libya, Syria, and Ukraine, not to mention states that have isolated and weakened them, just as a predator has isolated its prey from the herd through color revolutions that it has financed itself. In short, the psychopath is a robber. When we think about how the predators in the animal kingdom deal with their victims, we can imagine what is behind this mask of reason of the psychopath. Just as a predator masters all possible variants of sneaking and camouflaging in order to chase his victim, lure him out of the herd, approach him and break his resistance, so the psychopath invents all sorts of thoughtful camouflages of words and formalities, in reality, lies and manipulations, to assimilate his victim. Dr. Lobachevsky. In stark contrast to these imperialist, warlike and criminal acts stands the humanitarian behavior of the Russian government in Ukraine. For example, Russia has delivered more than 10,000 tons of relief supplies to eastern Ukraine, and even more, belying Western propaganda. Russia's attitude to the crimes committed in Palestine is also noteworthy. Just as in human relationships, the most reliable way to distinguish a psychopathic state from a moral state that has a conscience is to closely observe the actions of its rulers rather than their words. The difference between the crimes of the West and the actions of Russia is clear and unequivocal. The strategy of isolation is one of the most popular tactics of the psychopath, which is reflected in the Russia policy of Western governments. But this attempt failed miserably because Russia is everything, only no victim. Russia is strong and has understood who it is dealing with here. Putin is not isolated, but the elites use the devoted media to persuade us that he is alone and the whole world is against him. The psychopath does not dwell on facts. Facts and reality are alien to him. All that counts for him is the formation of his own perception of reality, and he wants to make everyone else join this distorted perception. He lives in an illusion of omnipotence. The psychopath acts exclusively in his own interest. He uses the hopes of ordinary people and abuses them for his own purposes. For example, he invokes principles such as freedom, defense and protection of the weak, equality, community or world peace to justify his actions that pervert these very principles. An unprepared person, too young, too inexperienced or earlier traumatized by a psychopath, will not recognize this manipulation and let himself be lulled in. Most of all, the psychopath fears an alliance of normal people. Since he has no inner resources or creativity, he cannot survive once the victim recognizes the true face of the monster. This abomination of nature, this predator within the species, and turns away from it. Copyright Sot St. Net psychopaths rule our world. 6% of the world's population are born genetic psychopaths. Can you imagine what this means for the rest of us? Much like a virus, and because psychopaths make up only a small part of society, between 1% and 6%, according to experts who study the phenomenon, the psychopath can only survive by parasitizing ordinary people like a parasite and contaminating their minds until they finally accept the most reprehensible actions against all morals. That is the principle of polarization. Psychopathic individuals generally stay away from social organizations characterized by reason and ethical discipline. Ultimately, such organizations are governed by that other world of ordinary people that is so alien to them. They despise the different social ideologies while at the same time being able to recognize their real mistakes without any problems. Once, however, the process of ponerogenic transformation of a human union into its still indefinite caricatured counterpart has begun and is already far enough advanced, they grasp this fact with an almost infallible sensitivity. A circle has been created in which they can hide their shortcomings and their psychological differences by finding their own modus vivendi and perhaps even realize their youthful utopian dream of a world where they are in power and all those other ordinary people are forced into slavery. They then begin to infiltrate the basis of such a movement. They have no difficulty pretending to be honest followers, since it is their second nature to act and hide behind the mask of a normal human being. Dr. Andrew Lobachevsky. Only by polarizing his victims can the psychopath complete his work of destruction. On the political level, the US, if you will, the world center of psychopathy, would not survive long if Europe were to free itself from America's influence and join forces with its geographically, historically and culturally natural partner, Russia. But this would require European heads of government of the caliber of Putin, which is far from reality at the moment. Take a look at a world map. You will notice that America is separated from the Eurasian landmass by two large oceans. Eurasia accounts for over 60% of the population and about the same percentage of resources. So, on its own, the bulk of world trade between Eurasian states would take place, and Eurasia would be the economic center of the world. Of course, the world doesn't work that way today. Instead, the US today is both the biggest economy and the only superpower in the world. 2 world wars and many other small conflicts were waged by the US to achieve this unbalanced state of division of Eurasia. Today, Western Europe is allied with the US against Russia and in some ways against China, and the Middle East is largely controlled by the US and Britain, or Anglo-America, as I like to call these bedfellows made for each other. Most of the African continent was exploited and kept poor by the same 2 countries, together with France, for the extraction of resources, and South America was, until recently, subjected to the same treatment. In this article I have explained how for most of recent history, at least throughout the 20th century, the main goal of Anglo-America was to prevent Russia from expanding. While attempts to achieve this were clothed in ideological empty phrases to gain public support, the real motivation was the very realistic assessment by American and British powers that Russia, and not Anglo-America, would rule the world in alliance with the rest of Eurasia, and probably Africa if Russia were to develop to the extent its resources and geographical location naturally allow. The normal person bases his or her relationships on exchange, cooperation, sharing, and empathy. He strives for peace, for freedom for himself and his fellow men. He does not attack anyone, he only defends himself and his own when they are attacked. The psychopath, on the other hand, uses the dominance and annihilation of others to exist. He is deprived of any capacity for empathy and creativity. The willingness to destroy, hate, anger, and greed are the only feelings that drive him. Free yourself from psychopaths. Anyone who has ever met a psychopath knows that any direct attack on the psychopath is doomed to failure. In fact, it is extremely dangerous to use the methods of the psychopath himself to attack a psychopath, and you risk losing your soul. In order to defend oneself against the psychopath, one must adopt a different attitude, take a different path, leave the reprehensible paths on which he wants to draw us. One must act for one's own purpose and not against the psychopath. Acting for something, not fighting against something. This difference is crucial. That's why bloody revolutions always lead to defeat, as history teaches us. Copyright Sputnik. Alexei Druzhinin. It seems that Putin understood this. He is not acting against the USA West, but in the interest of his country and other states. But not only that, he also acts in the interest of mankind, in the interest of certain principles: freedom, democracy, the right of peoples to self-determination. His actions can be traced at any time. He says what he is doing, and he does what he says. He surrounds himself with allies. He prefers cooperation, BRICS. He acts concretely and constructively. He defends the traditional healthy moral values. This vision is so radically different from the thought world of the psychopath that he perceives it as aggression. It is remarkable how Putin's attitude, his defense of traditional values, is completely distorted in the Western media. For example, he is accused of homophobia, a completely false accusation. He only defends the traditional family and the protection of the weakest, the children, against pro-pedophile propaganda. The fear of the psychopath is to be discovered, to see his mask fall, so that the others finally realize that the emperor is naked, that the people get together and start to share their observations. The alliance of normal people means death to the psychopath. Only when the victim has turned away from the psychopath, when he no longer believes his lies, when he has freed himself from oppression by peaceful means, not against the psychopath, never by direct attack, but by other means, acting for his destiny, only then is salvation possible. And only when mankind stops believing the lies of the psychopath, when it tears down the mask that hides the true face of the monster, and when it turns away from him, does the world have a chance to survive, to change course, and to escape the destruction that awaits it if it continues as before. What better way to conclude this article than with a quote from Putin himself, summarizing the fundamental difference between the US vision that infected the West and the Russian vision. It is simply the contrast between a materialistic worldview fixed on possessions, dominance by others and outward appearances, and a more spiritual, altruistic vision that strives for more than the simple satisfaction of one's own selfish needs. Russia and the United States are not ideologically very different. But there are fundamental cultural differences. Individualism forms the core of American identity, while Russia is marked by collectivism. A Pushkin scholar has put this difference very succinctly to the point. Think of Scarlett O'Hara from Gone with the Wind, for example. She says, "Never again will I be hungry." This is the most important thing for her. Russians have other, much more lofty goals of a spiritual nature. It is more about the relationship with God. We have different ideas about life. That's why it's so difficult to understand each other, but it's still possible. Vladimir Putin.
I choose this newspaper article as an addition to my remarks because it corresponds exactly to the truth and explains whose child on earth the USA really is. The USA, with its national and international anti-human and domination and world domination-addicted machinations and politico-military and Secret Service crimes, is the best model for those criminally degenerating psychopathic U.S. people who exploit or murder their fellow human beings, which also happens through religious sectarianism, which is particularly pronounced in the USA. In its own state, the USA, with its criminal and criminal political Secret Service and military machinations, serve as the very best model for the small criminal gangs that exist in their hundreds. In particular, however, the USA is an unparalleled role model for the large capital criminal organizations in its own country, as well as for all criminal and terrorist organizations around the world. And this is just as indisputable as the fact that only with the help of the USA such terrorist organizations could come into being, because the authoritative criminals in the USA were trained in combat and war, and later equipped with huge arms deliveries and all kinds of explosive ordnance, whereby not only Al-Qaeda is a best example. But I see you're looking for something in the computer?
I do, yes. Namely, whether I can find a description of the criminal organizations that you mentioned earlier, because I would like to include some information about them in the interview report and then also these.
Of course you can if you think it's important.
I think so. Here's something you can read along too. I think it's good. It's short and concise information. How do you feel about that?
That is actually the case.
Well, then I let the explanations immediately follow my words, and also use them when I call up the conversation. It just listed the 10 criminal organizations you named.
Mafia, the most famous and still today, one of the most brutal criminal organizations, is the Italian Mafia, which has its origin in Sicily. Today, La Cosa Nostra is murdering, dealing and blackmailing all over the world. She faces competition from her own country, the Neapolitan Camorra and the Calabrian 'Ndrangheta. The latter is considered to be the most dangerous and influential mafia organization, especially in international drug trafficking. Yakuza, they are not just gangsters, they are benefactors. For the Yakuza see themselves as descendants of the samurai worshipped in Japan, who take in worthless people. More than 80,000 members make the Yakuza the most powerful criminal organization in the world. 22 clans divide the entire underworld of Japan among themselves. Their business model: drug trafficking, gambling, and prostitution. Their hustle and bustle is watched by men in black suits who are covered with striking tattoos and do not shy away from murder. Hells Angels, the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club, HAM-C, was founded in 1948 in California by veterans of the Second World War. In the course of the 1960s, the group expanded first across the USA and then to other continents. The Swiss Martin Tino Shepard is regarded as the founder of the first Hells Angels group in Europe. Meanwhile, the biker gang is represented in 32 countries with so-called charter, local or national clubs. Their core values are honesty, reliability, respect and freedom. One recognizes the Angels by a death head with wings, which they carry on their back. In addition to arms trafficking and drugs, prostitution forms the economic basis of the Hells Angels. Triads are the names of Chinese mafia organizations whose members operate all over the world. The headquarters are in Hong Kong, where there are between 50 and 60 triads. As a symbol, they carry the dragon, which symbolizes strength and wisdom in China. A tribe has up to 20,000 members. These gangs are notorious for their particularly brutal methods of punishing their own members. The triads were founded by peasants and monks who rebelled against Ming Chinese rule. Only after the European colonization did they turn to criminal machinations. Marasawa trucha mess, but also for the particularly aggressive ant species Marabunta, Salva Salvadorians, and trucha Spanish slang term for vigilance. Its members are considered to be extremely ruthless and are known to kill unscrupulous people without scruples. The MAR is mainly active in drug and weapons smuggling. Aryan Brotherhood. At the end of the 1960s, the Aryan Brotherhood was founded in the US prison of St. Quentin. It is also known as the Bran, or AB, and is responsible for a whole quarter of all prison murders. Anyone who wants to be admitted must murder an inmate. Whoever tries to leave the gang will be murdered himself. Their name means Aryan Brotherhood and stands for the sympathy of Nazi ideology and symbolism. Mexican Mafia. The Mexican Mafia, also called Lime, or M for short, is one of the largest prison gangs in the USA. It was founded in the 1950s in Tracy Prison, California. Meanwhile, the MM has strongholds in all major prisons. The approximately 3,000 members maintain close ties to the Aryan Brotherhood, for which contract killings are often committed. Your walking rules are no betrayal, no homosexuality, no cowardice. In addition, members in freedom commit themselves to financially supporting gang bosses. Black Guerrilla Family. The Black Guerrilla Family, also known as Black Family or Black Vanguard, has about 50,000 members in the USA. The gang was founded in 1966 by George Jackson, a militant member of the Black Panther Party, to preserve the dignity of black prisoners. In the course of time, the Black Family increasingly made a name for itself through brutal acts of violence. But even today, the gang sees itself as a political grouping with Marxist roots. No wonder the right-wing radical Aryan Brotherhood is one of her intimate enemies. Crips. The Crips were founded in 1969 by two then 16-year-old teenagers. In the beginning, the gang consisted only of a loose network of different street gangs. Due to severe social tensions in their home region of South Los Angeles, the power and influence of the Crips increased rapidly over the years. They have about 300,000 members who wear a blue neckerchief as identification sign. The gang is considered to be very violent, whereby one not only wars against the rivals of the Bloods, but also often fights brutal internal power struggles. The sphere of influence of the Crips reaches as far as Canada. Bloods the Bloods, whose real name is Blood Alliance, were formed in 1972 as a split of the Crips, which they have been hostile to ever since. The gang wars have caused many deaths in the past. From the beginning, the Bloods were considered to be particularly courageous, so that they received much influx from initially hostile, smaller gangs. The Bloods recruit their offspring mainly from Afro-American school children, to whom they convey a feeling of protection and belonging. Access to expensive clothes, jewelry, and cash is also tempting. The members also call themselves CK's Crips Killer. Their distinguishing mark is a red neckerchief.
The explanations are really interesting.
They are, which is why I think they will also be of interest to the contact report readers. But I have another question, namely concerning the Zika virus, which was transmitted by infected Egyptian tiger mosquitoes Aedes aegypti, and which was now brought to Europe from South America via America by pregnant women. In pregnant women who are bitten by mosquitoes, brain damage and small headiness or microcephaly are found in the offspring. If you can explain something in a simple language for us medical lay people, then that would be good, because good information about such things is always valuable.
I have been dealing with this for years, so I can say that this mosquito species is also responsible for the spread of chikungunya, dengue, and yellow fever, as well as other viral diseases. Basically, every human being can be infected with the Zika virus. However, there is a particular danger for pregnant women and especially for their fetus. The virus migrates through the placenta and damages the health of the unborn child. In particular, malformations of the skull and the brain occur in the newborn offspring, whereby, as you mentioned, microcephaly or smallness appears. And it is not as harmless as the health authorities say it is, because it is not a simple viral infection or viral disease, but an epidemic-like form in which the pathogen begins to spread in the organism during transmission and can possibly cause long-term damage. The virus is trapped in the blood and spreads throughout the human organism, but also in the sexual fluids and can therefore be spread through sexual activity, blood transmission, and wound infections. In many cases, the bite infections of these insects are harmless or without symptoms subclinical, but about 30% of the infections often cause mild, flu-like symptoms, which are often accompanied by fever, skin rash, muscle and joint pain, and inflammation of the eye and conjunctivitis. In rare cases, a neurological disorder, Guillain-Barré syndrome, can occur, attacking the body's immune system and parts of the nervous system, which can affect people of all ages. In such cases, it is often the case that infected people develop ascending paralysis in the legs and arms, whereby in severe cases the respiratory muscles can also be affected. It must be said, however, that in most cases the Guillain-Barré syndrome is more or less completely regressed.
The Zika virus is spreading. But how does it happen? Is it only by human carryover, or also by insects or mosquitoes being transported through globalization to other countries, where they then do their stinging on humans?
The spread of the insects' breeding areas, as well as urbanization and globalization, mean that the Zika virus can spread globally. There is not only one type of insect, but two that can transmit the Zika virus. One type, Aedes aegypti, is only found in tropical and subtropical regions and survives only in warm climates. The other type, Aedes albopictus, is also found in colder regions and thus also in Europe and Switzerland. These insects are often unintentionally transported everywhere by humans due to globalization. For example, in natural food and in plants that are transported all over the world by airplanes, ships, and cars. In this way, these insects, like other insects, viruses, animals, and all kinds of animals, etc., and pathogens resulting from globalization can reach new areas and regions where they can reproduce if climatic conditions are favorable for them. And what is to be said in relation to the fact that the whole thing is played down by doctors is the fact that the Zika virus can mutate and also cause fatal reactions. Also, nausea and various other reactions as well as permanent organic damages belong to it. Like, among other things, also health impairments of the consciousness, which can cause states of confusion, etc. The sensation of pain can also change greatly, as can the eyes and hearing, etc., be affected.
What else interests me? Is there in Europe or in the USA, etc., a vaccination specifically against the bites of the Egyptian tiger mosquito and the flu-like symptoms?
Although I am making great efforts to obtain information about the state of the art of the relevant medicines in all the relevant terrestrial medical research laboratories, I am sorry to say that no effective medicines have yet been found for the virus itself or for vaccination. However, if flu symptoms occur, they can usually be treated with painkillers and antipyretic drugs.
At least something. But what is still a question? Microcephaly or small-mindedness is caused by a developmental disorder in the womb and can lead to severe impairments, in which alcohol, drugs, and toxins can also play a role, as well as genetic influences, as a Professor Dr. Eugen Boltzhauser at the Children's Hospital in Zurich explained to me.
That's right. Microcephaly is due to a rare disorder that causes the baby to develop a head that is too small. The reason for this is a developmental disorder of the brain in the womb or in early childhood. This can later lead to impairments of varying severity. Microcephaly can be caused by various genetic and environmental factors, but also by a rubella infection during pregnancy or a form of epilepsy, as well as trisomy 21, or a hereditary disease known as Down's syndrome, which also causes physical and conscious disorders, for which a doubling of the 21st chromosome is responsible. People with trisomy 21 have altered facial features such as almond eyes and snub nose. And as you say, in the womb, the fetus can be exposed to alcohol, anti-epileptics, drugs, or toxins.
That is clear to me. Anti-epileptic medication refers to epilepsy medication. But what must I understand by exposure of the fetus to alcohol, anti-epileptic medication, drugs, or toxins? Can I perhaps simply define this as the sum of all environmental influences acting on the fetus? If this is so, then it would be about the same as saying exposure of the object or living being, wouldn't it?
This is of course correct because it refers to the influence of the substances mentioned on the fetus.
Thank you, that's settled. Then I would like to say something about the fact that the world's powers of state are absolutely incapable of creating peace in a political way among peoples and throughout the world. The majority of these rulers only sit together and hold meaningless conferences, knocking big words, drinking lots of good wine, and devouring excellent food, but nothing valuable for peace building is discussed and undertaken. As at the climate conferences, the whole palaver of those responsible for the world is nothing but sound and smoke, which does not fruit anything and brings no success, except for millions in expenses, which have to be paid by the taxpayers. The greed for power does not in any way allow in a political way that peace can be created among the peoples and in the whole world. Therefore, in my opinion, there can only be one solution for peace building, be it among the people in general, or among the peoples and in relation to world peace. And this solution can only be that first and foremost people become peaceful with each other, and thus create peace. Then the solution must be continued in such a way that the people who have become peaceful with each other will strive unified over the heads of the state powers for peace in the peoples, and also for the peaceful union with the other peoples. Only in this way can world peace be achieved. For through the political diplomatic machinations of the rulers or the responsible authorities, the whole thing is a useless and senseless undertaking because they are effectively not interested in real peace, but only in their exercise of power. Therefore, the responsible statesmen only conduct disarmament talks, which, however, do not hit the nail on the head, because in order to create peace, politically hypocritical talks are not necessary. Because in principle it is about much more than just the abolition of weapons and weapon systems. Effectively, it is not enough just to want peace and to show a will for peace, just as it is not enough to reduce every armament, every weapon production and every weapon system, because even if all these murder weapons are reduced to such an extent, they still always represent a danger of war. And this is because there are enough quarreling cocks and madmen, and thus also crazy and irresponsible war and power addicts who can trigger a course of arms against an enemy at any time. Peace is therefore also not secured where the armament is only defensive, and where the desire for war is replaced by the term willingness to defend. Because fundamentally it is the case that where an army is designed to prevent wars, peace is not peace, but only a false peace that can at any time be transformed into an effective war. So even a defensive army is not a guarantor of peace, but a warrior, and consequently the whole thing cannot be reconciled in this sense with real peace, and consequently even a defensive state has not made any progress in terms of peace. Peace is only possible if weapons and weapon systems no longer have to serve effectively as enemy deterrents, but only as products of human ingenuity, and as means for all kinds of peaceful purposes. However, the materials used for weapons and weapon systems should be used fundamentally for the production of productive equipment, while armies should be directed towards performing useful and valuable work for the benefit of populations and the community. It can also be taken into consideration that the weapons and weapon systems, which would also have to be designed and manufactured as working tools, could also be used as weapons if necessary. for all cases in which any need for such use should arise. However, the whole of what is threatening is not likely to take the form of civil and international war actions. But that is not the only way to peace, for it first and foremost means that man learns not to wage wars, which he can only learn by peacefully striving for true friendship and humanity with his fellow human beings and with the community and peoples. Peace-building can only be the result of centuries of painful learning between people, for what emerges from politics will always be doomed to failure. For what traditional monarchies, great powers, and small states do in peace-building are only political, diplomatic, and useless skirmishes which never lead to real peace. And as I said before, the abolition of armaments alone is not enough, because in order to create effective peace, freedom, justice, charity, and the effective will for peace are also preconditions beforehand. But it must also not be the case that one people dominates, subjugates, exploits, or even plunders the other and lives at its expense. Nor must there be a class system within a people, whereby the superior suppress and exploit the inferior. So also in this respect, great efforts of solidarity and sharing in solidarity must be made. But it will take a very long time until this is achieved in earthly humanity, where the massive overpopulation is to blame for this. Because the more people there are, the more difficult and increasingly unlikely it is that the goal of peace among people and nations, let alone world peace, will be achieved. Therefore, unless the overpopulation is drastically and rigorously reduced, an effective peace among people and peoples remains an unattainable utopia, as well as a world peace. As long as people have something to eat and drink and have everything according to their needs and desires and everything is what they think and want, then they call for peace and use empty, big words in peace negotiations. But when they no longer have what they want and can no longer receive it, then they fight and fight about it and fall into war with each other. In this moment, all sense and every word for peace is forgotten. Therefore, darkness falls over the consciousness of the people, and they have no more peace visions. All of a sudden, their senses and aspirations are directed only towards blood, revenge, and retaliation, and they cry out their misery full of rage, because they find that, precisely because they have nothing to eat and drink anymore, and their needs are no longer met, everything is wrongfully done to them. The majority of the state leaders and the responsible heads of the authorities then speak in their favor and accept money and gifts as payment. So in this way the peace of men, nations, and the world is again and again irrevocably put to an end before it can also only come about. The legal will of those who want to do everything right and well is countered by the majority of those in power and their followers from the peoples with false political diplomacy and even more military armament, and therefore lied that armament can guarantee peace. But this lie is only a lazy adaptation to the politics of the great powers, and all those who seduce their surroundings and peoples by lies to deadly disobedience, so that strife and strife prevail, whereas the powerful can then send their military and security forces away by force of arms. Thus the truth is that the majority of those in power grant their peoples protection and false peace only in the event of their subjugation. Instead of creating real peace, the majority of the leaders only want to keep their place and rule visibly over their peoples, and even over the whole world. They even rise in self-increase to the center of the world, namely against the will of the peoples, and thereby cause popular confusion. Consequently, people no longer know what they are doing or not doing and what they should understand as lies or truth. But the people of all peoples have always been so trimmed by the powerful authorities that they conceal their own opinions, their reason and their will, and only recognize the anti-peaceful machinations of the secular government authorities, which invite each other to allegedly solve their conflicts. Worldwide, they are palavering all fruitless nonsense together regarding weapons and weapon systems, disarmament and rearmament, quasi-zing about the abolition of professional armies and military service, as well as that all men and women should be enabled to make a living and live together peacefully. The truth, however, is such that nothing, absolutely nothing of it is done and implemented, because everything is just empty words, which are babbled about in a binge, and without any will to pervert. Such lying promises, made and served to the people, do not require clean politics, but only dirty wickedness and abominable deception with regard to the peoples by the majority of the power seekers, in which the minority of righteous politicians and rulers have no chance to penetrate and to put forward their good and right objections and leadership moments, let alone to realize them. However, the majority of those greedy for state power of all kinds promises liarsily and slimy a concrete liberation of people and peoples from hunger, misery and misery, whereby however nothing is effectively done for it, because neither a necessary birth stop nor an effective worldwide birth control is addressed, let alone introduced. With stupid speeches about fighting hunger and development aid, etc., this topic is simply swept under the table, and thereby the overpopulation continues to grow, together with all the evils resulting from it, by the criminal machinations of the enormous and still growing humanity. Deceitful and hypocritical promises are also made by the majority of the unrighteous state leadership greedy towards the peaceful people in their own homeland and all over the world. It is therefore a lie, without anything really being done, that fear is fought by free and unreserved renunciation of weapons, weapon systems and the military, that a lasting learning of war actions is done by a radical reorientation and an inter and coexistence with all necessary things, which also includes a lasting peace. But everything is just sound and smoke, for all nations go their way through the great power-hungry ruler, who is false and deceitful, and much of the people cheer this great power-hungry man of the state, let him live high, and are foolish enough to believe him. These fools of the peoples who believe in authority see their attachment to the majority of the unjust politicians and rulers as a self-obligation and do not realize that they are only stupid recipients of promises with regard to idiotic disarmament talk, and in truth follow lies that have no value whatsoever. Because neither peace can arise from it, nor poverty, misery, and hunger can be fought over. Neither military means of power nor religious sectarian transfiguration can save humanity on earth if the right thing is not done, namely the enforcement of a worldwide birth stop and a subsequent rigorous birth control. The good and righteous religious and political authorities make clear what is right in terms of the disarmament will on behalf of the peoples, but they are simply disregarded and talked to death by the unrighteous majority of those in power. Hope for a worldwide and lasting peace is effectively based on the fact that the majority of the state authorities, politicians and ruling courts hold above themselves and recognize everything that has been self-inflicted hostile to peace and reverse it on its wrong course. A realistic hope for peace exists for the people of Earth only where they face the self-inflicted catastrophes of their history and recognize themselves as causers of discord and of all human and destructive power, and finally turn everything for the better and good, and thus to true peace.
The abolition of armaments and all weapons alone is not enough to create a lasting and effective peace. Peace, as you have said, also presupposes justice, as well as that not one people dominates, subjugates, exploits, or even plunders the other and lives at its expense. And as you have also said, there must be no class being within a people. Every human community must be such that all human beings, without distinction, are on the same level, and one level must not oppress, exploit, or dominate the other. It can only be a wise guidance, but it must be correct and prudent and guide everything comprehensively for the good of all. And by this I mean a leadership that effectively leads and guides the people or peoples in the sense of the term leading, but does not stand above the people and rule them. For governing in our sense means directing and ruling, which means that in relation to human beings, these are directed and controlled according to the will of another human being or their several others. In fact, the entire earthly population still needs to make very great efforts in terms of democracy, solidarity, and the sharing of solidarity in order to achieve true peace, equality, and equal rights among all human beings on earth, including women and men. The promises repeatedly made by earthly politicians and governments that they would work for the peace of peoples and their freedom, as well as that they would endeavor to promote the worldwide disarmament of weapons and weapon systems, and to use the conversion of weapons for peaceful, protective and security purposes truthfully only leads to the appearance of warlike, revolutionary, and terrorist machinations. On the one hand, this is due to the fact that elements willing to revolt, war, and upheaval feel challenged to want to change everything according to their wicked will with naked force of arms. On the other hand, the arms industry feels obliged to produce its weapons and weapon systems and sell them to countries that long for them because they can defend and retain their dictatorial power. And they want to do this before real facts of peace are created. So a decree is also needed in relation to the manufacture of weapons and weapon systems, which prohibits the manufacture and sale of weapons to states which use them to terrorize their own people or to carry out arms operations against other countries. However, the whole thing must also be directed by a decree towards the fact that even privately, only persons of absolute integrity may acquire and possess weapons that pose no danger whatsoever to their fellow human beings. The mere threat that this or that person should be threatened with a weapon, or even hugged or killed, no matter what he or she has done, should be a reason for a ban on weapons because people who make such threats are unpredictable and absolutely irresponsible towards life and therefore have no weapons in their hands. The very thought of threatening, harassing, or killing oneself or another person with a weapon is irresponsible and criminal, and no weapon belongs in the hands of such a person. The use of weapons against human beings may only be justified in an absolute emergency to protect one's own life or that of another, and may only be used fatally in the very last emergency if there is no other possibility. The worldwide motive of hope of the terrestrial people with regard to the disarmament and conversion of weapons and weapon systems is absolutely fruitless if a real peace is not created in the framework you and I have mentioned, whereby first of all the people must create peace among themselves before a peace of the peoples and finally a world peace can be considered. As long as, however, the march of the highly armed peoples is still being consciously pursued, and the majority of those responsible for the state are only making great and stupid speeches with regard to peace negotiations, as well as doing nothing for a worldwide birth ban and comprehensive birth control, peace negotiations will continue to come to nothing. This, on the one hand, because they are not meant seriously by the majority of politicians and rulers, and on the other hand, because the more people populate Earth, the more elements promote the insurrection, the unrest, the revolt and terror, as well as the warfare which ultimately leads to anarchy. And this alone because the human being on Earth becomes more and more unrelated to his fellow human beings as well as egoistic, unscrupulous and thoughtlessly unfeeling and more self-centered, does not want to treat the others anymore and degenerates into stinginess. And all these evils prevent that peace can generally become among Earth humans. But also because everyone only still thinks and acts for himself, and neither real personal love nor neighborly love are present, and what still exists in this respect is becoming more and more atrophied. Thus every old-fashioned promise of salvation, as it is preached by unrealistic religions and sects, becomes ridiculous, not least because these institutions only speak stupidly and desperately, without instructing people how and what they have to learn in order to really live according to the creational natural laws and recommendations. Religions and sects do not teach people that they must first and foremost create peace, freedom, and harmony in themselves before they can pass on these values, so that their fellow human beings can also learn from them and become harmonious and balanced peacefully, liberally, and in all their thoughts and feelings as well as in their actions and actions. Even the ancient prophets and wise men taught that all war armor should be forged into agricultural implements and made unfit for war. This demanded total disarmament, but not an absolute ban on weapons, because people need them for self-defense if the need should require it, but how they should also use these weapons as useful working tools. So it has been taught from time immemorial that earthly man should open his eyes and senses to the fact that he perceives and understands everything correctly, so that no rebellions, wars, and no terror bring harm to the present and the future. But religions and sects have not thought for the future since time immemorial, but only for the present, which is why they do not bring a long-term doctrine, such as the doctrine of truth, doctrine of the Spirit, doctrine of life. And since this is the case, and religiously sectarian demands are made of man only for the moment and the present, without there being a comprehensive doctrine and decisive instructions for the journey, nothing can be learned and nothing can be given for the future and the behavior of people on their way. And as you are wont to say, through the religions and sects, learning is only a matter of threshing on empty straw, so that not a single grain can be harvested. And you are more than right about this, because the so-called teachings of religions and sects do not correspond to any teachings, but only to empty phrases and empty phrases of a pointless kind, from which earthly man can learn nothing but only fall into a delusion. This always lasts for life over all lives, because in relation to religions and sects, people are confronted again and again with the same aspects of faith and delusion. But if earthly authorities, politicians and rulers still practice and stir up war, earthly people as individuals and as masses should all the more clearly take the path of peace, so that all murderous means of attack and all degenerated weapon systems are smashed and destroyed. And this should also apply to the occult, religious, and sectarian practices of self-assurance which mislead and harass believers. The fact is that even through the religions, the righteous are equipped with the false work of peace and the word of peace, that only God is to be trusted, who gives victory to the righteous in war, etc. Peace is only secured where every armament and force of arms, as well as every coercion and every other force, are defensively discarded and no desire for war exists anymore. Even with regard to an assumed willingness to defend, for which a defensive army is designed to prevent wars, and consequently, despite pure defensive allure, there are warlike heirs. So where defensive armies exist, no real peace has yet been achieved, so the whole thing does not mean progress in terms of peace. Peace is only effectively possible where weapons have become productive devices, where there is no army to wage war or defensive war. Only when no man is taught any more to wage wars, and when no man is enemy of the other any more, can real peace come about.
The traditional promise of peace, which is proclaimed again and again and which all peoples on earth are searching for and hoping will finally come about, is still completely unfulfilled. The peoples and their authorities still do not think in any way about orienting their decisions towards real peace. So earthly population is still a long way from following the path promised to everyone at the turn of the century from 1844 onwards. Because contrary to earlier hopes, everything is unfortunately developing in the opposite way. The people of Earth do not use their weapons as effective instruments of peace, but as always for murder and manslaughter, because they do not stop learning war and declaring war to the so-called enemies. As ever, they are power-hungry and dictatorial, domineering and unpredictable in their greed and psychopathic moods. As a consequence of their greed for possession, power and domination, they obviously cannot handle their decisions in mediation and judgment, so they constantly sharpen their swords to decapitate their supposed enemies and force them down with evil force. But the direction of the majority of earthly mankind is unambiguous, because for them, there is no alternative to the task of widespread enmity with one another, and consequently also the majority of those in power and politicians work in the same anti-peaceful framework. As a result, they are all continuing to row towards the provision of modern weapons of human destruction, the majority of those in power, politicians, and the general human race itself. Working towards international legal agreements on disarmament and peace is always proclaimed to be urgent. But something really valuable is not being done in this regard. Because if something is already achieved, then on the one hand only a few weapon systems will be reduced to a minimum. While on the other hand all the alleged peace decisions are nothing but a farce, because they are only fictitious acts of peace. And that has been so since time immemorial. Which is why in the last 1,000 years, there was only about 250 years of peace on Earth. But not in one piece, but over the millennium only in short months or weeks during which there had been no uprisings and wars, which adds up to about 250 years. Every killing of human beings is to be rejected and contradicts the creational natural laws and recommendations, be it in the form of manslaughter, murder, terrorism, religious fanatic machinations of all kinds, by any form of insurrection, etc., or by death penalty. Basically, everything falls under murder, including armed self-defense. So the promise of peace among men and peoples, and also in relation to world peace, must be fulfilled in a non-violent way, through reason and understanding, love and charity, good and positive interpersonal relationships, friendships and enlightenment in relation to the creational natural laws and recommendations, and their fulfillment. And the universal prophet Nocodemion has already begun with this teaching, and his followers of personality, the prophets from his spirit line, have done the same as all the wise men who have ever walked earth. They have all at all times instructed men of earth, as individuals in themselves as well as among their peers, to keep peace together, and to proclaim it to all nations, and to carry it out into them. And if in this way the prophetic, denunciatory consciousness is spread and carried out into the future, so that the people of earth learn to understand peace and its meaning, then it can only be that one distant day real peace will enter into every single person, into all peoples, and into the entire world population. But if the doctrine of truth, doctrine of the spirit, doctrine of life, and thus also the doctrine of peace do not work, then earthly mankind has a very bad and catastrophic future ahead of it, because all warlike and terrorist evils continue to bring all misery, all suffering and ruin. This is because then people will continue to take their swords against people, and war and terror will reign, unless the people of earth forge their swords into plowshares and their lances into sickles to cultivate the land peacefully. And it is doubtful that this will happen unless understanding and reason, love, peace, freedom, and harmony are finally created. And that this will be the case, and that it will get much worse, is proven by the events around the world today, which are becoming more brutal, inhuman, constantly more extensive, and more numerous from day to day. And this happens especially because people on Earth become more and more through overpopulation, who degenerate more and massacre each other conscientiously and senselessly and treat each other like dirt. Consequently, already for large masses of overpopulation, a human life is no longer worth a chanterelle. Every man who is still able to perceive and understand reality and its effective truth can convince himself of this, namely whether he is completely uneducated and not able to speak, or whether he is educated and masters rhetoric. The fact is that from time immemorial the three main religions, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, have not promised any popular or worldwide disarmament, but punishment and death through violence, war, and readiness for martyrdom. And this has been preserved to this day, although, of course, it is carried on in this way. And this is done by the majority of the authorities and politicians as well as by the religions and sects, even if they hypocritically preach peace and love. But bigotry has been a tradition since time immemorial, because it can mislead people and peoples, enslave them consciously, and exploit them in every conceivable evil way.
What you say is undeniable. But now, dear friend, should we turn to private things if you don't have any questions?
Actually, it's only there to, if that's all right with you.
Of course I do.
What I've wanted to ask you for a long time refers to what your father Svath explained to me. That earthquakes and volcanic eruptions influence the gravitational waves of Earth, or change them in a certain way, whereby the gravitational vibrations can be measured and registered. Such and other gravitational oscillations, Svath explained, would arise on the one hand on all active planets, but also when planets or 2 or even 3 black holes, but also suns or galaxies collide. He also explained that such events produce very strong gravitational oscillations which propagate at very high speed throughout the universe. However, as I have searched in vain for relevant explanations in specialist journals and books so far, I want to.
Up to this day, you cannot find any descriptions concerning this phenomenon in earthly scientific publications, because as far as I know, there are no findings and experiences corresponding to the matter, no findings or experimentally successful attempts of specific efforts concerning findings and recordings of gravitational oscillations. For my part, in the last 10 months, I have no longer personally tried to make observations with the relevant earthly scientists and researchers, because this task was assigned to other persons. I then have to ask them about the state of affairs, which I had planned to do only after 1 year of handing over the task. That is to say, in 2 months' time. What my father explained to you, however, embraces full correctness.
Then must I understand by what you say that Earthlings cannot yet measure and record Earth gravity vibrations, nor the other gravity vibrations as I have called them according to your father Svath's explanations?
That is the point of my words, but it has to be said that there have been years of efforts in this direction. But 10 months ago, when I assigned the observation task to others, there was no significant prospect that the experiments would be successful in a short period of time.
Well, that's for sure. Then I want to ask you about the ozone layer. Already in 1975, your daughter Simya-se gave me explanations that earthly ozone layer is damaged or dissolved by earthly mankind. Earthlings then switched and banned various ozone-depleting substances for use, according to which it has been said for years and decades that the ozone layer would recover and the ozone holes would close again, or at least decrease. I do not, however, take that away from those researchers, scientists and those responsible, because I believe that this cannot be possible, because I believe that the damage to the ozone layer is continuing in relation to the growing overpopulation.
This is indeed the case, because the unstoppable growth of overpopulation on Earth means that the damage to the ozone layer continues to progress, although the whole thing is becoming more and more precarious because, in addition to the pollutants banned by the authorities, there are various other pollutants which are produced by the mass of overpopulation and which enter the atmosphere and thus also the stratosphere or the ozone layer and destroy them. But now, dear friend, I still have private matters to discuss with you and also to tell you that I will be back here in 2 weeks because it requires urgency, which I do not want to talk about today. So listen then what I must still take up privately.